5 Days in May, a sound documentary highlighting the 124th annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association, brought to you by Smith, Kline and French Laboratories.
That we conduct this demonstration, and I'm making a plea to the people here, and especially to the police, that we conduct it peacefully and we conclude it peacefully.
I declare this 124th annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association now in session.
From May 3rd through May 7th, 1971, Washington, D.C. played host to over 10,000 psychiatrists and guests attending various sessions on subjects ranging from multimedia teaching of introductory psychiatry to diagnosis, measurement, and evaluation. For the first time, informal eye-to-eye confrontation was possible in an experimental series of sessions called Meet the Authors. And as participants and guests alike ticked off the sessions of interest to them, as they ran down a program that included such subjects as racism, neurophysiology, behavior therapy, human sexuality, and psychopharmacology. As they moved from room to room within the 3 hotels where the meeting was being held, outside the air stirred with the chanting of anti-war demonstrators and the sounds of police bullhorns. But the walls between inside and outside didn't really exist. Discussions within the meeting reflected the tensions in the street. There were disturbances and interruptions. As James Reston remarked,
"In short, the political atmosphere is unpredictable and polluted. In fact, mental pollution may be our most serious environmental problem."
Let us now move back in time to May 3rd and the opening gavel.
I declare this 124th annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association now in session.
That is the voice of APA President Dr. Robert S. Garber, whose address opened the meeting. His subject, the proper business of psychiatry.
Is that we shall maintain our posture and our style as a medical specialty and as a behavioral science. The corollary being that we do not propose to see our association converted into an agency for the purveying of propaganda and political preference. We must help define the good society to influence the moral and public weal. We must bring our professional and scientific judgment to bear on the formulation of public policy in areas that relate to mental health. It is partisan politics that as an association we must avoid like the plague. Like the universities, we must stamp out any temptation to politicization, mindful that in the long run it would destroy us as a profession and a science. There are any number of partisan groups of various colorations to which we may repair as citizens. But let us maintain our integrity as a professional association. Let us get on with our search for the evidence that will support a major contribution from psychiatry to the resolution of the disaster-threatening problems of our times. But let us never forsake a critical scientific judgment on the validity of the evidence that we muster. Let us make certain that our public positions emanate from within the realm of our special knowledge and clearly identify the mental health component of the issue to which we address ourselves. When our positions involve us in politically controversial matters, as they surely will, let us make clear that our position is professional in its intent. And let us always sustain a style that is appropriate to our status as a medical specialty and a behavioral science.
But before the meeting was a day old, some of the turbulence of the times injected itself. Monday night, when former Attorney General of the United States Ramsey Clark was about to be introduced, there was an interruption by Dr. Herbert Shear.
Any convention of psychiatrists that chooses to ignore 7,000 arrests in the streets of the city in which they meet, and the murder of the Vietnamese people cannot consider itself relevant or moral.
After the interruption by anti-war sentiment, another social issue of the times injected itself into the hardly begun meeting. Dr. Franklin Kameny took the microphone.
I'll tell them what I told you. Dr. Franklin Kameny has a comment.
About 2 or 3 minutes.
2 or 3 minutes.
We, as homosexual men and women, demand our right to live and love. All right, order, please. Live and love as we choose. We are sick and tired of your...
Finally, the first guest speaker, Ramsey Clark, addressed the meeting. He spoke of turbulence and the capacity for positive and negative expressions of turbulence in man.
We needn't fear turbulence. Shaw called Beethoven the most turbulent spirit that ever found expression in pure sound because of his Ode to Joy, his Ninth Symphony, because he wasn't afraid of the expression of the human personality, and he rather relished something new and exciting and different and the chance for something better. But from all of this comes a capacity in our people to injure others, to violate norms, to take or destroy property. From whence does that capacity really arise? We need to know, don't we? Poverty in our lives, we must...
Mr. Clark went on to discuss the effects of poverty in our times and ways in which the law and psychiatry might deal with these effects. Then he turned his attention to a long-standing issue between psychiatry and the law.
You and I, as lawyer and psychiatrist, engage in one great and intolerable and harmful waste, in my judgment, and that's in this business of litigating mental capacity to stand trial. Let's wake up, America. We can't engage in these nonsensical games. It's like segregation. Does it really matter whether that child is in a segregated school because of de jure or de facto history? Isn't the inequality the same either way? Why don't we just say, and say this with the problem of alcoholism too, which has no real place in criminal jurisprudence, nor does addiction in my judgment, that first we have to determine whether society really has any sanction over this individual. If he has not hurt anyone, if he has not destroyed property, who are we as society to say, come with me, and if you don't, I'll bring you, and do as I say? Then why don't we just do this? Why don't we first try to determine in our way whether the act alleged was committed by the individual involved? Worry about whether he was drunk, whether he was addicted, whether he didn't know what he was doing because of mental illness. Later, if we determine he committed this act that we as a society have said is impermissible because it hurts people, then we have in justice the right and the duty to try to solve his problem with him. Then we can bring the resources that we have to bear for his case. If he's an alcoholic, that will be a major part of his problem, perhaps a small part for some, but it will be a part. If he's addicted, that will be a major problem there. If there is mental illness, that will be a major problem. And then when we bring the psychiatrist, the psychologist, and the social worker to bear on that problem, their efforts will have a fruit that's meaningful in diagnosis and care and cure for this individual.
Then, after emphasizing the contribution psychiatry, and particularly social psychiatry, could make in meeting the rising problem of turbulence and change in our world. He concluded with a lawyer's view.
We're going to have to live together. In Camus' words, we're all condemned to live together here forever on this soil. And what we have to do is, in the old unhappy word again, become involved. I'll give you a lawyer's view of the necessity of our time. He was speaking for individuals. I believe it applies equally to institutions such as this association tonight. It's Oliver Wendell Holmes, 51 years ago now. He said his life is action and passion. It is required of a man that he be involved in the action and passion of his times at the peril of being judged not to have lived. Let's live. Thank you.
Turbulence in the world around us. The convocation address by Ramsey Clark dealt with it on Monday night. The panel of the Radical Caucus also dealt with it on Tuesday. The moderator of the panel was Dr. Harold Kaufman. You will now hear him recognize Dr. Virginia Downs, who was concerned with the turbulence created by the returning Vietnam veteran addicted to drugs.
Go to the Capitol and you're right around the corner from it. But in any event, the call for doctors is necessary. We are part of the healing profession, and as healers and as the priesthood of healers in this society, we definitely could contribute in some way for this. Yes?
To this. Make a comment.
Surely.
In regard to the handling of the heroin addicts from Vietnam who are returning, do you know that they are all being discharged dishonorably, and this makes them ineligible for treatment at the veterans hospitals in the country, which is our only national hospital system? Do you feel that we should present a resolution that their dishonorable discharge of Vietnam veterans who are returning on the basis of the heroin addiction be discontinued, and the Veterans Administration prepare to treat these people in the fashion which they deserve? With your permission, I'll prepare such a resolution and also add it to the number that are going to be presented before the Adolph Mayer lecture. Is that correct? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Was this in the form of a motion? It's already passed by acclamation.
On Tuesday, Section 4 of the APA meeting dealt in detail with child psychiatry. Dr. Lawrence M. Greenberg, in reviewing Dr. James H. Satterfield's studies of hyperkinetic children, drew a correlation between Satterfield's physiological findings and the clinical findings of Dr. Greenberg's own group, which he outlined this way.
These findings led to the speculation that the heterogeneous population of children labeled hyperactive could be divided into two ideologically oriented groups. The first, those subjects characterized by slow and inadequate processing of information, and the second, those characterized by a CNS cortical overload. The latter group, the overload, frequently described by the psychologist and the psychiatrist as manifesting abnormal thought processes, may deteriorate on psychostimulants, but appeared to respond well clinically to psychodepressants, such as chlorpromazine. They responded with improved reaction time and improved accuracy of performance. The characterization by physiological tests, the skin conductance and the EEG with evoked potentials, of high and low arousal groups of hyperactive children has considerably broadened these speculations. It is tempting now to combine the clinically observed with the tentatively physiologically defined. That is, the low arousal, quotes, best, quotes, responders with slow or inadequate information processors, and incidentally with the significantly depressed patient. And the high arousal types, the, quotes, worst, quotes, responders, with the CNS overload patient and the patient with abnormal thought processes. One speculation is tempting to make. Coleman in '69 reported that platelet serotonin levels appeared to correlate with outcome of psychostimulant therapy. In a very limited sample of hyperactive children, good responders had low serotonin levels initially, which increased with successful pharmacotherapy. This finding, while it contradicts the report of Wender et al., who studied urinary amine metabolites, needs to be studied much further. The platelet serotonin level, which may correlate to CNS levels of the amines, should be studied to determine its relationship to the arousal level. I would anticipate a direct relationship. In summary,
Dr. Martin Roth
I
of the
look
Department of
forward
Psychological
to
Medicine of the Royal Victoria Infirmary, Newcastle upon Tyne, England, spoke on human violence viewed from the psychiatric clinic. His paper was delivered at the 10th Annual Adolf Meyer Lecture.
Confront us. First of all, are innate or environmental factors mainly responsible for the best studied forms of aggressive conduct? Secondly, are there forms of violent behavior and types of violent individual that can be characterized as maladaptive or pathological? Thirdly, how are they to be identified, making use of criteria that contain no implicit judgments of value or elements of social bias? And finally, how can these forms of violence be separated from those varieties for which the concepts derived from psychopathology and psychiatry have little value or are irrelevant? I shall describe what is essentially a personal excursion into this difficult, extensive, and treacherous territory, and will not presume to claim for my own overall look scientific validity or authority. The apologies that are due I shall...
After a far-ranging and scholarly review of the field, Dr. Roth concluded,
there are four conclusions I can summarize. First, the evidence suggests some natural lines of cleavage between the different forms of activity in which men behave violently towards one another. In the swiftly increasing prevalence of lawless and violent behavior that has been witnessed in many countries, we are therefore unlikely on these counts alone to be traveling on the ascending limb of a curve which has Armageddon at its apex. Secondly, to a limited extent, heredity is bound to play a part, but in the best studied forms of aggressive and predatory conduct in man, specific and potentially remediable damage is done to the developing individual in his formative years, and the personality becomes warped. Given the means, there are therefore positive lines of action to pursue along practical, socio-medical, and scientific lines, and international cooperation here should prove of inestimable value. Thirdly, psychiatrists need to give urgent attention to the more clear definition of terms such as sociopathy and psychopathy to ensure that there is no danger of unwittingly confusing dissent and no more with psychiatric pathology. Fourthly, the bad reputation that some biologists have recently given to the human species does not appear entirely deserved. The obscenities of war are undeniable, and the past provides little encouragement for untempered optimism. But there is also evidence to favor the view that man is the most affectionate, altruistic, self-denying, and cooperative animal on the planet, as well as the one who has wreaked so much destruction. In overlooking or devaluing the former, there is a danger that the most positive force for constructive effort may come to be neglected. There is too much talk...
In addition to the broad view of psychiatry in terms of the general human condition, various papers in the meeting dealt with specific treatment of individual disorders. Such was the panel on drug treatment of chronic schizophrenia. Dr. Solomon C. Goldberg of Chevy Chase, Maryland, presented these observations on the recurring question of how to select the most useful drugs for patients.
This would be, I think, a worthy study. I'd also like to point to another finding that was reported by Pryan and Cole in the chronic schizophrenic study that we did a few years back. I think parts of it are just appearing in the literature now. The studies involved thorazine and stelazine and patients who, these are chronically hospitalized schizophrenics, who were recruited from the available pool at 7 hospitals, and eventually there was an analysis to see who the chlorpromazine responders were and who the stelazine responders were. And it turned out that the chlorpromazine responders, well, I'll put it the other way, the stelazine responders were those who in their routine treatment before the study had been getting epiprazine, of which stelazine is an example. The chlorpromazine responders, on the other hand, were those who had not been getting epiprazine in their routine treatment before. Now if you assume that their routine treatment before had been a trial and error matter of eventually finding what was best for that patient, a little hit and miss, but eventually they got onto it. This seems to be evidence of the differential activity of even the phenothiazines in this case, so that giving some credence to the notion that there is a right drug for the right patient. Now, how else...
Dr. Heinz E. Lehman of Montreal looked at pharmacotherapy in hospitalized chronic schizophrenic patients.
And finally, in the hospitalization phase, which involves the care of the chronic patient, that is after 2 or 3 years of hospitalization, one of 3 decisions regarding pharmacotherapy must be made. The first one, most important, is to determine which of the chronic patients are really refractory to treatment and not just still in the hospital because their pharmacotherapy regime, for whatever reasons, has been inadequate in the past. This distinction can often be made with a systematic high dose, 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams of chlorpromazine, 4 to 6 months clinical trial over a period of 4 to 6 months. A certain percentage of these chronic patients may become dischargeable following such treatment. But among those who have failed to respond to this energetic pharmacotherapeutic final trial, and among those who are too old or have been hospitalized too long, there are some who require treatment with neuroleptics for purely symptomatic reasons. This is a second decision to be made. They may be too destructive, too energetic, or too bizarre in their behavior, even for the high tolerance prevailing in a hospital environment. In a controlled study of drug requirements of such symptomatically treated patients, Prine has observed that most patients who received between 300 and 600 milligrams of chlorpromazine did equally well with just 300 milligrams a day. And most patients who received less than 300 milligrams a day did equally well with placebo. He concludes, and I think he's right, from these findings that many chronic hospitalized schizophrenics receive doses of neuroleptics which are too high or altogether unnecessary. From this it would follow that the third decision to be made for chronic hospitalized schizophrenic is not to give them any drugs unless there is a therapeutic hope or a definite symptomatic need to justify pharmacotherapy. A systematic approach of this kind to the treatment of the hospitalized psychotic, particularly in the chronic stages, might save the state money, the hospital staff work, and most important, the patient some of the late and not always reversible side effects, which Dr. Crane is going to discuss in a little while.
Some of the side effects found in treatment of chronic schizophrenic patients were discussed by Dr. George E. Crane, panel moderator.
Let's talk about eye opacities of the lens and the cornea and the retinal changes. Now, as far as eye opacities are concerned, which are not very harmful, my suggestion, and I made it in a recent article in the APA journal, my suggestion is that if a patient gets, let's say, an average of 600 milligrams of chlorpromazine a day, he can be seen once every 2 years, because it has to do with a cumulative deposition of those substances in the eyes. You don't have to do it more often. When it comes to retinal changes, it depends on the drugs that you're using. If you use any drugs but Melaril or Serentil, they belong to the same family, I don't think you have to worry about retinal changes. I mean, it's wise, if a patient has been on very high doses of chlorpromazine for years and years, it's wise to do it every once in a while. But if you give Melaril, and if you exceed the dose of 600-700 milligrams a day, you should do it quite often, every 2 or 3 months. If you don't exceed this dose, I don't think you have to worry too much about it either. If you exceed the dose, which I don't recommend, and the manufacturer does not recommend either, of 1,000 milligrams, then you would have to do it once a week, because a retinopathy can develop in 3 or 4 weeks on those high doses. But my recommendation is that you should not exceed the dose recommended by the manufacturer, which is 600 or 800 milligrams for Melaril, and I think 200 for Serentil. Those are the only 2 drugs on the market of that type. Now, you talked about blood counts. It all depends on how you feel. Now, the big danger is the agranulocytosis. Now, you have to use certain guidelines. If you have an elderly patient who is female and has some physical disease, you have to watch the patients very, very carefully at the beginning of treatment for the first 2 or 3 months. And I don't care how many blood counts you do, the task will be futile unless you examine this patient physically. If the patient has any signs of an acute illness, particularly a sore throat, fever, and so on, unless you do that, a blood counts are useless, because you might have a good blood count, the next day the patient might have a granulocytosis. As far as doing blood counts in a general population, after many years of treatment, you do it routinely once a year, like you would do for any hospitalized patients. Now, if the hospital wants to do it every 2 years, it's okay with me too. There is no relationship between...
While drug treatment of chronic schizophrenia was being discussed, still another panel, in concurrent session, was concerned with controversial issues in psychiatric hospitalization. Tuesday, May 4th. The panel, Controversial Issues in Psychiatric Hospitalization. There, Dr. Marvin Hertz, director of the Washington Heights Community Service, New York State Psychiatric Institute, said,
Now, based on these studies and my own personal experiences, I offer the following conclusions. Psychiatric hospitalization is an important and necessary treatment modality within a comprehensive community program. For most patients, hospitalization should be avoided unless there are clear-cut indications for it. If hospitalization does occur, it should be brief, aimed towards rapid reintegration of the patient and resolution of the immediate crisis which led to hospitalization. Follow-up care should be available, preferably by the same team that treated the patient in the hospital. Patients should be encouraged to function at the highest adaptive level commensurate with their ability at any given time. If long-term psychotherapy is indicated, it should be conducted while the patient is in the community, dealing with real stress of life. I feel that long-term psychotherapy within a hospital can only be justified for those patients who have such self-destructive lifestyles or are so disturbed they need to be protected while therapy proceeds. I don't quite understand why some hospital psychiatrists believe that after 2 or 3 months or even a year of analytically oriented psychotherapy, borderline or schizophrenic patients can achieve a reconstruction of their personalities. These patients have severely impaired ego functions and predominantly pregenital conflicts, which may take many years to work through, if indeed they can be. A question that is largely unanswered is what is the effect on the family and community of early discharge from the hospital of a psychotic member? Our research group at the Psychiatric Institute is in the process of investigating this question.
Another panelist, Dr. James Finkelstein, senior psychiatrist at the South Beach Psychiatric Center, expressed the need for more exact definitions of which mental patients should be hospitalized and which should not, with particular attention to addicted patients.
One major issue is whether the psychiatric hospital is the appropriate place for the inpatient care of the addicted patient. There are 3 basic reasons why inpatient units for addicted patients should be in psychiatric hospitals. One is that the incidence of serious psychiatric illness, including schizophrenia and major affective disorders in addicted populations, is high. It appears to vary according to how patients are selected for hospitalization, with chronicity, age, and social class being important variables. In any case, there are many patients who will require treatment for psychiatric illness in addition to specific treatment for addiction. While in theory such treatment might be provided through a psychiatric consultant in a non-psychiatric institution, in practice this is difficult. The role of the consultant is more distant from the patient than that of the treating physician, and much of the success of psychiatric hospital care depends upon the orientation of ancillary personnel, which is far more likely to be appropriate in an institution with psychiatric leadership. Secondly, the principal pathology in all addicted individuals is behavioral. The acquisitive and manipulative behavior of addicted individuals is well known, whereas some of this behavior is the result rather than the cause of addiction. A specific effort is often required to help patients alter their lifestyle. One thing I think I feel called upon to say, although it's not down here, is that I've been reflecting today that addiction is often seen as a means of protest, or a means of trying to express the sense of frustration that comes about through one's feeling that one lives in a unresponsive society, and where responses to the normal means of protest turn out to be tear gas and illegal arrests. It may be that to some degree we are responsible for this. My conclusion is that addicted patients often need inpatient care in psychiatric hospitals, but are not usually successfully treated in the same milieu as psychotics. They should be treated in psychiatric hospitals, but in separate units where their own group identifications can be fostered, where medical and psychological elements suited to them can be provided. The milieu will contain many authoritarian elements. This has its dangers. Power is always subject to abuse. It seems, however, to be a necessary element in the treatment of addictive diseases. Whether the addicted patient can learn to adapt without this authoritarian structure is a question for future investigation. Patients who are both drug users and psychotics present a special problem. The best solution is probably to decide in the individual case which type of milieu is appropriate, bearing in mind the possibility that the patient can move from one to the other as treatment progresses.
Thank you, Dr. Kameny.
Alcoholism, smoking, aggression and rage, electrosleep, child abuse. Just a few of the subjects of talks and discussion groups during the 2 previous days. Various approaches to the continuous questioning of the human condition, clinical and non-clinical. Wednesday, May 5th. A most interesting approach to the modality of psychotherapy was made by Dr. George E. Valand of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Dr. Valand's paper was entitled, "Mental Illness is Not Why Men Get Psychotherapy."
That such a high percentage of apparently successful college men sought psychotherapy merely confirms the evidence, well summarized by a number of people, that the rich, the educated, and the comparatively healthy seek and obtain a disproportionate share of psychotherapist time. In the United States, there's simply not adequate psychiatric manpower to offer the adult population the amount of psychiatric care obtained by this privileged sample of 890 men. But the study also suggests a less widely appreciated fact, that the person who visits a psychiatrist has much in common with the person who frequents the general practitioner's waiting room or is referred by the medical specialist to the medical social worker. Such a person experiences subjective ill health and tends to lack social supports, and yet not infrequently may be in objectively good physical health. I've got no doubt that many of the men who sought psychotherapy were mentally ill, and that many who were free of emotional distress did not turn to psychiatrists. But statistically, in this sample, many of the items that reliably correlate with objective psychiatric illness were not associated with a decision to seek psychotherapy. Only when one focuses down on that group of men who saw psychiatrists 50 or more times does objective mental illness become statistically apparent. Studies of psychiatric clinics have suggested that the uneducated lower classes somatize and take pills, and that the educated upper classes seek psychotherapy. But such studies have not used non-patient peer groups for comparison. This population had a median income of over $25,000 a year. 70% had attended some graduate school. Yet the tendency towards somatic complaints correlated positively with a tendency to seek psychotherapy. And sleeping pills and tranquilizers were used currently 10 times as often by those who had ever in the last 25 years sought psychotherapy as by those
who had never seen a psychiatrist. A second finding was that men who get psychotherapy have few social supports. Yet in this population, presence or absence of social supports appeared quite independent of physical and partially independent of mental health. The data showed that the conservative who goes to church often and enjoyed a stable marriage was just as likely to be unable to think under stress as his more lonely liberal neighbor. The social supports per se did not markedly diminish suffering. They only diminish recourse to psychiatrists. Psychiatrists themselves, often of a liberal, non-church-going, unathletic bent, sometimes view church-going, golf-playing, hippie-disparaging conservatives as highly defended individuals who avoid psychotherapy and are basically unhappy if only the bastards would admit it. But in this population, engaging in competitive sports was neither strongly associated with robust health nor with right-wing political views, but it was associated with good marriages. Even unathletic psychiatrists might agree that to be lucky in love, one must sublimate, not suppress, aggression. In the same vein, at 47, to want the role of government with regard to the individual increased, and one's middle-aged status quo dissolved by student activists, may reflect personal loneliness and social helplessness, as often as it also reflects mature and altruistic social consciousness. But such arguments lead into treacherous ground, and what I'm really trying to simply say is that ready recourse to psychotherapy may reflect the loss of security of the small town, as well as freedom from its parochialism. The purpose of presenting the strong association of certain life history items with psychotherapy is not to present definitive answers. Rather, the utility of this report is to remind our profession to ask certain questions. Should scarce psychiatric help go to those with subjective or with objective impairment? Can the prevalence of psychiatric illness be determined by focusing on those who receive psychiatric treatment? Is a psychiatric patient somebody who needs or someone who seeks a psychiatrist? Perhaps the credo of the 20th century psychiatrist must remain that of the 19th century internist: to cure sometimes, to relieve often, and to comfort always. Even if we sometimes fail to reach patients who are objectively mentally ill, our patients suffer and ask our help in establishing stable bonds to other people.
An element new to the 1971 program was Meet the Authors. Here, papers were delivered in written form only, and discussions were heated and informal. In groups clustered around different authors throughout the room, questions came fast and furious. So did the answers. We listened to Dr. Thomas Sass of Syracuse, New York.
Well, you know what? Anyway, what they believe is beside the point. Did Johnson believe that he was going to pull out of Vietnam? He claimed it. Does Rockefeller, but every time Rockefeller now has run on 4 times. Every time he runs, he says, I'm going to lower taxes. Every time he's elected, he raises taxes. Does he believe it? You ask him. It's a joke. If politicians lie, that's just politics. Nobody believes it. If mental patients lie, that's called psychosis.
Doctor, were you talking about addiction at one stage?
Way back.
Can I ask you a question about it? Sure. Do you feel that an addict has a claim on the community to support his addiction to keep him from crime?
That is a very, very fine question. I don't think the addict has a claim on the community, but I don't think the addict, so-called, would be likely to commit a crime if there were free trade in drugs, because he would be able to satisfy his addiction.
Well, why does he have the money?
Well, why shouldn't he have the money?
A poor addict would.
Poor addict would get, no, yes he would. No, a poor addict, no, excuse me, a poor addict would get social security. Sure. Food stamps. He would trade his food stamps for opium. But if you had free trade, you could buy opium for probably for 1 cent a package, like chewing gum. There would be no need to commit a crime. Absolutely not.
Until his tolerance got up outside his financial range.
No, but it would still be very cheap. It would be extremely cheap. It is so cheap. Look, you can grow poppy by the acre. It would be cheaper than wheat. But in fact, people wouldn't take it. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. I mean, people take it because it's forbidden. How many people in America would be addicted? That's ridiculous. People have other things to do. Of course, in Turkey, very few people are. I bring this out in my paper. It's a joke. We are complaining that the Turkish produce opium. Why don't the Turks complain that we produce corn and potatoes to make alcohol, which is against their religion? This is exactly like the Inquisition in Spain. The only thing you can do is be a Catholic. The only thing you should take is alcohol and cigarettes. The young people are right about this. If you take anything else, it's no good. Only American addictions. The rest of the foreign stuff is no good.
Except Scotch.
But Scotch is not foreign.
Now, as the APA meeting neared the halfway mark, audiences could look back on many hours of opinions by the experts. Questions on expert opinion? There were lots of them, for several sessions called Question the Experts were also part of the 1971 program. One of these sessions dealt with psychopharmacology. Dr. Frank Aid of Baltimore chaired the meeting. The panelists were Dr. Gerald L. Clerman of Boston and Dr. Gerald J. Sarwer-Foner of Ottawa, Canada. Typical of the questioning.
Dr. Galt from Boston. I have a question about persistent or tardive dyskinesia. Namely, is the piperazine group of the phenothiazines here again more implicated as in other extrapyramidal syndrome?
Well, first, let me, for the benefit of anyone here who doesn't know what the term tardive dyskinesia or persistent dyskinesia means, let me define it for you. This is a neuroleptic-induced neurologic syndrome which evolves very slowly, almost as imperceptibly as the unfolding of a flower. The patient is the last one to recognize that he has something wrong. More often, it's the family if the patient is outside of the hospital or is being visited by the family. Now, over a period of time, it has become clear that this usually begins in the perioral region. It can occur almost at any age. It increases in frequency with advancing age, but this may be related to duration of treatment more than the age factor alone. Originally, it was thought that it occurred almost exclusively in individuals who had pre-existing organic brain disease. We now know that's not true at all. It can occur with any neuroleptic under the sun. The difficulty is that most of the patients who have developed persistent dyskinesia have had a multitude of neuroleptic medications, either conjointly or in sequence, and it's very difficult to know which, if any, one is a greater culprit than another. One of the first symptoms, as far as I'm concerned, is that when the patient is speaking to you, you begin to see little vermicular movements of the tongue. Then you begin to get other muscular movements in the perioral region. They have some difficulty in respiration. Some develop some hemibolismic movements of an extremity, and so on. And as time goes on, they become totally disabled. I can only tell you this: once this condition is full-blown, that does not reverse. It has been reported with every phenothiazine, with every thioxanthine, and with the butyrophenones. Now, it has not been reported with some of the more recent compounds, but this may be only because of the short duration of treatment. It's clear that the higher the dose, the more likely one is to get it. For example, the longer the patient's on the drug, the greater the risk. And there's no way, that I know of anyway, of predicting who is likely to develop persistent dyskinesia. And this is something that I think we have to be aware of, because the only thing I know to do is, once you see these early symptoms, if at all possible, discontinue the medication, and then it reverses itself. Now, Walter Freeman's got his hand up, and I think we ought to give him the benefit of telling us what he knows.
Walter Freeman, San Francisco. Just one little practical point in recognizing the earliest phenomena that we've been speaking about. That is, have the patient open his mouth as wide as possible, keep it open, and look at the tongue.
That's right.
And if you get these vermicular contractions in the tongue, you know you're faced with it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Walter, very much. That's exactly my observation, and that's what I ask my patients to do on maintenance therapy. Now, every one of them think they're going to look at a sore throat or something, but in fact, all we want them to do is see that tongue.
My name is Dr. Henry Tavishan from Bronx, New York. Is there any justification in concomitant use of both in the primarily psychotic patients, like the combination of a phenothiazine and a minor tranquilizer, let's say, is there a qualitative difference in the anxiety demonstrated by psychotic versus the neurotic patient? And if there is such a difference, then an attempted combined or concomitant use of both types of tranquilizers would be not well justified.
I'd like to elaborate a little bit on the issue of combining a neuroleptic or antipsychotic drug with a minor tranquilizer of the diazepoxide type. And of course it has theoretical implications, as the gentleman points out. The facts are that there's not a two-way exchange. Low doses of butyrphenones and of phenothiazines and thiazanthines seem to be as useful in the non-psychotic anxiety states as in some instances, or many instances, as the meprbamate diazepoxide derivatives. However, the converse is not true. High doses of the meprbamate, or even moderate doses of the meprbamate type, or the diazepoxides, are not useful against the psychoses of mania, catatonia, schizophrenia. There is only one exception to that, and that is the diazepoxide series in high doses is highly effective in the DTs and other alcohol withdrawal syndromes because of cross tolerance. So there is a psychosis for which the diazepoxide derivatives are useful, but it is specifically the alcohol withdrawal states. But for the functional psychoses of the schizophrenic syndromes, the diazepoxide have only limited utility. They will ameliorate that fraction of the clinical picture which may be related to insomnia or to anxiety, but they will not affect the thinking processes, they will not affect the paranoid mechanisms. I think it's an interesting theoretical question in psychopathology. The conclusion I come to is we have to then say that whatever the psychophysiologic substrates are of anxiety, there are two types.
Members of the APA also heard a very non-clinical paper by a non-psychiatric questioner whose lifetime career has been one of questioning the experts. He was James Reston, political commentator and vice president of the New York Times. Mr. Reston is a long-time observer of Washington, some of its psychoses, and the psychology of his colleagues.
To begin with, in defining the psychology of my own trade, I should say that modesty is not the most prominent characteristic of newspaper people. My colleague, Joseph Alsop, is forever rebuking the great men of the world for wasting his time, by which he usually means giving him information which disagrees with his conclusions. Now, in our business, we like to remember that this country had a press before it had a government. Even the founding fathers were instructed by the 18th century pamphleteers. In the beginning was the Word. So we are not very sympathetic to the notion, which is rather popular in the government here at the present time, that our job is to concentrate on good news or on making the government's record palatable to the people. This is, after all, not a democratic but a totalitarian view of the function of the press. Having said this, I must in fairness try to define the limitations and weaknesses of Washington reporters and commentators. Officials in a free society rise and fall with the tides of public opinion. We influence in the press that opinion less than we sometimes pretend to do, but we do have the power to wound officials and to weaken public support for their policies. And this is known only too well by the men at the pinnacle of any Washington government. The result is that we are not always reliable observers of presidents, cabinet members, and others who work behind the screen of executive power and privilege. For when we see them, they are always on display or on guard. It is not that we don't want to see the real article. It is just a fact of life that cats are wary of dogs. All presidents, like top men in most institutions, almost always manage the news in the sense that they naturally emphasize what is good and minimize what is bad. And this makes the task of accurate reporting exceedingly difficult, especially in this town. The result is that commentators are constantly psychoanalyzing presidents, and doing so in the sure knowledge that we are not being told what they are thinking, but only what they want us to think they are thinking. Maybe in your profession you have the same problem.
5 days in May. 5 days of discussion, debate, and dissent. The 124th annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association was ending. The end of the meeting was just the start of the challenge.
But let us maintain our integrity as a professional association. Let us get on with our search for the evidence that will support a major contribution from psychiatry to the resolution of the disaster-threatening problems of our times. But let us never forsake a critical scientific judgment on the validity of the evidence that we muster.
This taped report has been brought to you by Smith, Kline & French Laboratories. Applied Concepts, New York, has produced this program in its entirety. Additional copies of 5 Days in May may be obtained by writing to Smith, Kline & French Laboratories, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.